Great, thanks for coming. So, this 40-minute session is interactive, so there'll be a bit of presenting from me and a bit of interactive elements where we can vote and kind of comment on things, and then right at the end there'll be kind of discussion time as well. So, in essence, this is kind of a bit of a story of my master's research that I've done over the past 4 or 5 years. And really, it's kind of positioning MOOCs from kind of going from a hyped thing where everyone was joining in to actually demonstrating what kind of impact they've had upon institutions that have produced them. So, first of all, we're going to have a quick overview of kind of how the research was set up and designed and who it covered. Then there's going to be some key results with some interactive exploration. So what I'm going to do is going to ask you some of the questions that the survey asked and see if our results are the same, and use them as a starting point to kind of have some further discussion. And then there's that's going to kind of deep dive into 2 of the kind of key themes that came out, which is one is the pedagogical impact on the universities or other institutions that have run them, and then also how they've kind of specifically been catalysts for different types of change within institutions. And at the end, there's kind of a 2017 update of where this research kind of sits now, and then there's a quick 5 minutes at the end where if people have questions or we want to kind of discuss some of the other points, we can do so. So, moving on, a bit of an overview. So this was actually started in 2011, and looking at this kind of the hype cycle, it feels like that the kind of 2012 when they first really kind of started getting going in the States, there was quite a lot of...
Sorry,
okay.
Is it shared for the session? Okay, great. I'm just asking to let you know that you can move into lunchtime so that everyone has their allocated time allowed to their presentations, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Cool, don't worry, it's only a 40-minute session and there's nothing after me, so we're not going to run into lunchtime. Yeah, I don't worry, I'm not going to pad it out to like 60 minutes or anything. So basically 2013, that's when I kind of decided, right, MOOCs, I want to understand what's going on here. And for me, attending ALT in 2013, it's when Haggard and everybody released kind of maturing of the MOOC, which was like a business government report to kind of inform politicians as much as businesses about what are MOOCs, what's going on with them, why should be interested. And it really summarised everything that had kind of been happening across the world at that point. So in 2015, when I got down to really having some time to start, the conversation I think had started going towards maybe like the plateau of productivity and people becoming slightly unsure about the utility of them. So again, I think in 2015 the conversation maybe moved away from MOOCs and back to online learning, and then certainly onto blended learning and kind of on-campus experiences as much. So my kind of point there was that MOOCs, though, hadn't gone away. There were still institutions starting to produce them and get on board, and those that had started early were continuing to produce them. But my kind of grappling with things was that MOOC research was still kind of an emergent area. There'd been lots of small scale studies done, but there'd be nothing kind of very holistic. And what I decided was that I would not try and pin everything down at the beginning. I would deliberately keep things quite wide so that it could evolve, as this was still kind of quite a fast changing area. And what I kind of found in 2015 was there were lots of doing and people saying, I've done this, I've produced this is what our institution's doing. And there'd been quite a lot of small level studies maybe looking at kind of learner participation or smaller kind of facets of it. But there, again, as I mentioned, there wasn't like this overall concept of why were MOOCs actually being run, what impacts were being had upon institutions from a kind of staff perspective and a student perspective. But 2 broader studies did actually exist. There's one which is the USA survey, this time was called Grade Level Tracking Online Education, which had been running for a few years, and this time this included data around MOOCs. And then there was a project called International MOOC Strategies in Europe, which was an EU-funded project. And again, that was looking specifically at MOOCs, but was being quite focused on how they thought European MOOCs were potentially quite different from the ones that had evolved in the USA. So they kind of formed a good basis. And what I kind of found is that it seemed that there were 3 main themes. there was kind of drivers and rationales for producing MOOCs, so the reasons why institutions claimed that they were actually going to produce them. Then there was the kind of the area of how are they going to be implemented, so how have they been produced, how have they organised people, have they hired people, have they hired external companies, how has it worked with kind of the flow of information around institutions. And then 3, the thing that really interested me was the impact. So, you know, okay, all this activity is going on, but is it changing anything? Are people noticing it, or is it like still kind of an island of innovation, as it were? So what I did is, I ended up using those 2 surveys mentioned previously as a basis for kind of starting to get into the research. So at this point, we're going to start with some of kind of the first questions I started with. So it's interactivity time already, and if you can either use the Socrative student app if you happen to have that installed on your device, or if you go to that, you can either use the short link or the full link at the top, and you should get a page that looks a bit like that. And the room name is MOOC 2017. If anyone has any problems, just let me know. People getting in there okay?
Yeah.
Does anyone still need the link? Can I?
Just one.
Cool. So let's start this then. Can do this nice and anonymously, I'm not going to ask for names. So here's the first question. Has your institution or organisation produced MOOCs? So we've got 4 people logged in. Is it okay if somebody isn't logged in? Is that?
Yeah, my connection is dropped.
Okay, not to worry. Well, feel free to join if you can, but don't worry about it. Okay, let's see how many people did. So everybody said yes. Excellent. There might be a bit of confirmation bias here because maybe you're all at the session because you're interested in MOOCs. But okay. Next, do you know what rationale was used to start producing MOOCs at your institution? And I've kept it as a simple yes, no. But do you feel that you could explain to somebody else why your institution started producing MOOCs? Okay, so a split. So do you know how and by whom MOOCs are produced at your institution? Let's have a look. Everybody does. Excellent. And do you know of any impacts that MOOC activity is having? And that could be on a personal level, or it could be things you've observed across the institution. Okay, cool. Right, we shall come back to these. We'll hop back here. So, these questions were the kind of the things that I was starting to get at and think, do people know this? And as far as I could tell in literature, nothing had been written about it. So, those 3 main themes kind of produced loads of questions. And as I said, I used those other 2 surveys as a basis for some of them, but also just use this as kind of a bit of a mapping exercise where I just thought of all the potential questions that could be asked and tried grouping them. And at this stage, like with any kind of research, there was far more questions than those kind of initial ones that we started with. So it kind of started out posing more questions. So I thought we're going to organise this somehow. So I grouped them all by themes and then started linking certain questions back to themes. So what we've ended up with is that a way of generating the survey was that all of the questions generated and themes generated and tied to specific questions, so that the survey itself was then split into 3 sections. Each section had like a sub-theme, and then the survey questions kind of mapped onto those sub-themes and impact. So it meant that despite asking a wide variety of questions, they could all still be kind of made sense of later on. And to kind of get it, so that would be great for kind of providing quantitative data, but really it might not understand the why or the how. So I decided it was time to have interviews as well to kind of provide context. So in terms of the order, it ended up deciding that the survey would come first and then would select some participants for interviews to kind of deep dive at some of the kind of themes that popped up. So I think at this stage it's true to say that it was unique that it looked at the implementation and impacts in addition to the drivers, because the surveys previously had looked mainly at the drivers and kind of the intentions of institutions rather than the impacts. And again, I wanted to not just target kind of senior management. I wanted to kind of find out from all the roles across the universities and other institutions, what impact was it having? Because I think that would give, again, a holistic kind of view. And I deliberately repeated some of the questions that had already been used in those previous two surveys, not only to kind of add to the existing knowledge, but also to kind of use that as a way of validating perhaps some of the results I was getting to see if they kind of tallied. And it was really good because I got permission from both of them and we kind of did some collaborative work. So that was really exciting at the time. And again, as I said at the beginning, because it was kind of a wide approach, I wanted to let some things come up to the fore. So, at the beginning, it's all very well me kind of saying, well, here are the themes and this is what I think we might find out. But I wanted the ability for kind of emergent things to come up. So, if something unexpected was happening this year, maybe that, a few it kind of appear in the survey or the interview data as a more prominent theme than perhaps I'd thought. So, this next section is going to be about 20 minutes, and really going to take you through kind of the key results of the survey. And the kind of challenge for the Masters was fitting it into kind of detailed analysis within the context of the word limit that I had. So I had to find a way of kind of being quite selective. So, overall for the survey, it launched in 2015, and then it actually closed the following year. And there were 217 kind of complete responses, and there were 35 partial responses. And I still used some of the partial responses within the data analysis because not everybody wanted to answer every question. And it managed to cover 28 countries and 96 unique institutions. And I had a little kind of bet with myself that I wanted to get more responses and a wider reach than the previous surveys and achieve that. So that was like a little kind of personal motivation to get this going. Saying that, just because I'm in the UK and obviously I've got lots of networks of people in the UK, a lot of responses were from the UK. So it is fair to say that 78% of the responses are UK based, which implicitly is interesting because most providers are using FutureLearn, so that might give a slight kind of bias to the data. So that's kind of in the background as a warning.
Quick question.
Yeah.
You've got 500 responses. Do you know what was your target population?
So you mean in terms of
The total number of people that could have responded?
that could have responded? No. Mainly because it was quite a wide remit. I wanted to try and target everybody from kind of senior management down to people that were actually producing the MOOCs or programming MOOCs. So, I mean, that could be thousands of people, but I didn't actually kind of quantify that. So in terms of the interview stats, 148 people indicated they want to be interviewed, so that's quite a lot of people. It's great. But I picked 10 people, and the way I've selected that was to make sure that it represented not only people in the UK but across the world, but also that it represented people outside the higher education sector. So there's kind of a balance there. So we've got some NGOs and some private education places as well. So, as I said before, there was this tension between letting things emerge and trying to pigeonhole things into specific themes. And this is the way I kind of went into trying to make sense of things. And you can kind of help me do this. So, let's hop back to the polling software. And it says, what do you think is the primary objective of an institution's MOOC? And if you would just select any that you think might be a possible one. So you can select as many or as little as you like. So what's that?
Do you want the URLs?
Oh, yeah, of course. Let's have a look. Sure, it might let you in. So, hop back. There we go. Have you got the address? Oh, never mind. Right, let's hop back. So, let's have a look. Okay, so we've got reach new students, increase institutional visibility, and flexible learning opportunities are kind of the top three, and the other one's kind of roughly drive student recruitment slightly higher, but the rest are kind of there. So, okay. So in terms of my survey, that's quite similar. That's pleasing. So, interesting. So, I mean, that is interesting because this is a gamble that I was thinking this could turn out completely differently. So it's kind of, so yeah, it's good that there's difference as well because it means that maybe stuff has again moved on since this survey was taken. But okay, so that was interesting. This is quite similar, and this actually tallied with all of the primary objectives reported by all of the other MOOCS surveys. So basically, the similar kind of increasing institutional visibility, driving student recruitment. Interestingly, there's some emergent ones here, like innovative pedagogy, but flexible learning opportunities. So you can kind of see that overall the pattern was quite similar, and it kind of had remained quite similar. Now, what this means is to be seen in a minute. So then, what I did here was turn the question on its head. So this was asking, previously it was asking people about what they thought it was. This is now asking people what do they actually think MOOCs have done. So let's hop on to the next one. So this is MOOCs at my institution have actually, and then if you select any things that you think MOOCs have done at your institution. If you're not sure or you don't think they have, just don't select it. Cool. Let's have a look. Okay, so we've got, we need to supplement online campus learning, increase the visibility of the institution, and create flexible learning opportunities. Okay, see, this is interesting. This is. Does anyone find that Google often just decides to try and recognise your voice? Yes, that's interesting. So if we go back to the survey again, that's relatively similar. Well, the one thing that I would say has changed definitely is being used to supplement on-campus learning. I think that's, as you'll see later, that's a trend that's kind of on the up. So the results from the survey that I analysed did seem to kind of show three things. They seem to demonstrate institutions said they had a strong rationale about why they were producing MOOCs. And the actual impacts that people were reporting seemed to kind of tally with that in a loose way. And so I thought at the moment, what this showed kind of from the survey data that was that people were responding in the same way. So not getting into the meaning yet, but the actual data collected seemed to be kind of consistent, which is a good start. So the tricky bit was how to kind of turn interviews into kind of stuff that could be mapped back to the survey data. And I did this by, afterward, the interviews were based upon asking people about their responses. So for each interview, I ended up picking out the questions that they had kind of responded most strongly to. And Then basically did a thematic analysis, so tried coding up all the interviews back to the themes that had kind of generated early. And this made sense. Making sense of the interviews, again, impact seemed to have the largest amount of responses. So trying to mash them all together basically and find which themes had the kind of strongest repetition and kind of interest. And these were, as I said before, pedagogical impact, widening participation, and change. And again, at this point, it was, I'd say, quite a strength that there was a breadth of responses, but now, with the interview data, could really kind of dig down into the nitty-gritty of what that actually meant. So, theme 1, which is pedagogical change. So, this, I think, was a bit of a kind of emergent theme. It was talked about quite a lot in the interviews, and actually came up quite strongly in some of the survey results. And really, this is one of the outliers where, in terms of the impact that institutions thought it would have, that hadn't been kind of mooted as a reason why people would actually get involved. So the interesting thing here is that there was also a question about asking people about their secondary drivers or any other drivers, and it was kind of like a background driver. So people, when asked to produce one driver, were saying, maybe it's visibility, maybe it's student recruitment, but actually if they were listing more than one, pedagogy did come up quite high consistently. So it's kind of maybe an element of wanting to experiment, but not kind of admit that they're actually experimenting with this new kind of way of doing things. So, and again, there was also a slight kind of hint that I thought, well, why isn't it fine? Why can't you just say, actually, we just signed up to have an experiment? I mean, that's a valid thing. But I don't think that's the argument that some places use to kind of justify the funding. So in terms of quotes from interviews, people said they were trying to find out about the space, trying to find things out, and we were also doing it because of kind of the Me Too, like other people are doing it, so maybe we should. But people, did admit that actually that the thinking had become a lot more strategic, so that as time had gone on, as you'd expect, they learnt from some of the experiences and also probably had to justify why they could continue producing them at their institutions. So what does pedagogical change look like? So in my mind, MOOCs are kind of about scaling as much as about openness and participation. You've got to deal with the potential of large numbers of people. So looking at the research, some people thought that, it's the packaging of the resource types within MOOCs that are kind of the key thing. It's how they're bundled together. I'm not saying I agree with that, but that was one kind of approach. So, quick quiz again. What type of resources have you seen used in MOOCs? And again, some of these might seem a bit overlappy, but they kind of all tie to previous surveys. So again, select any resources that you have seen used in MOOCs. You there? Cool. Okay. I mean, that's pretty typical. I'd kind of argue that videos in particular or animated content is kind of almost a de facto standard. Whether it's pedagogically innovative though is another question. And that was kind of, again, that is quite similar. Videos, images, discussion boards, roughly similar to the key ones that you suggested as well. But, again, thinking about this type of resource here, well, fine, this is happening within MOOCs, but is it happening across institutions anyway? So again, do you think that staff use and creation of content itself has changed? So again, hang on, that's the wrong way. Oh no, where's it gone? Sneaky preview. Forgot you saw that. So yeah, so basically select if you think that use has increased with any of these. Okay, that's interesting. So some people think the existing resources, but not that many. And okay, so there's a kind of like a bit of an apathy, like maybe there's a bit of increase going on, but I think most people are probably like maybe unsure. That's what I would take from that. And in fact, the survey itself said that staff creating provision of digital resources is increasing, but you know, I mean, they're relatively balanced. A lot of people are kind of saying, well, there's obviously a trend here, but it's not kind of consistently that everybody is doing this. And my point was thinking, well, fine, is this happening anyway? Is this actually to do with MOOCs? So I did some number crunching, because I asked another survey question to ask people, fine, do you think this is to do with MOOCs? And what people generally responded quite strongly across was that people thought it was partially as a result of MOOCs, so that they felt that there was some impact, some awareness happening, but it wasn't actually MOOCs weren't solely driving that. But my point here is, well, digital content doesn't really mean innovative pedagogy. Here's a Downs quote from 2016 was saying that MOOCs delivery methods, not changes in curriculum. And, you know, if we're going to play the kind of open university card game, they've been doing long-distance video since the 70s and 80s. So there's nothing innovative about using video necessarily. So I was thinking, fine, well, maybe increasing digital resources are a good groundwork for maybe trying out other things, like blended and flipped learning. So, again, has there been a change in blended learning at your institution? And this is a quick one to answer.
Is that because of MOOCs or just generally?
However you want to interpret it.
Okay.
Okay. So some people increased, most people unsure, nobody thinks it's decreased. So the overall trend is a slight increase overall. Here, quite similar really, people thought that it had increased since MOOCs had been produced, but again, this survey asked the secondary question, do you think it's attributable to MOOCs or is it a separate thing? And 70% did think that it was partially attributable to MOOCs. So again, it's kind of picking up on this theme. It feels like there's something happening, but they can't quantify that it's kind of causally linked. But they're kind of happy to say that it's maybe driving it a bit. I've already said that. So the interviews got at this a bit more deeply. People saying quite specifically it's helped push the idea of blended learning, and then it's also kind of funneling people towards thinking about new ways of integrating online learning and on-campus learning that perhaps they weren't before. And again, students at the institutions, have they taken part in MOOCs? So again, I think this is the last interactive question. So have students at your institution taken part in your MOOCs? And again, select any that you think apply. Great. Okay, yes, encouraged by staff, yes, signed up by themselves, I'm not sure. So again, there's nothing really strong, but there's kind of almost a smattering of there is some movement towards that. And again, that's relatively similar. There was kind of people saying this activity is taking place, but also there's a fair number of people saying, I'm not quite sure if it's taking place. So, again, it's kind of a balanced picture. They did find that when students were dipping in and out of MOOCs that were not kind of specifically tied to a course, that was more to kind of supplement their understanding. So obviously there were some students accessing things out of interest, but I'd say there probably wasn't a lot of people kind of directly being driven to them as part of their kind of programme of study. But, people were thinking about how to blend MOOCs specifically onto on-campus learning. And in Australia, they run quite a few of these, and they've kind of coined MOOCs, but blended online, open on-campus courses. I think, play the acronym game, probably what we called SPOCs. So, top of my head, I've actually forgotten what that means now. But small but online course, yeah, which is, I don't know if it's an oxymoron or not, but these things are happening. And again, some of the other questions were about kind of policy insight, a kind of change happening at policy insights about, student education, direction of travel for kind of digital resources. And again, people were kind of saying, well, there is change going on, but I think it's partially, we couldn't definitely say hand on heart that it's just to do with MOOCs, but you can see again how it's a factor. And again, in terms of the VLE, do people think that the use of the VLE has changed since the institution has produced MOOCs? At the time, a lot of people, over half, were like, well, no, I don't think it has, it's just continuing. There were a few people that said, maybe a course that says yes or somewhat. But in fact, last year, looking now this year, it's definitely that, there have been quite a few places like University of Leeds, Australian University, University of Sheffield where I now work. There are specific courses being produced for on-campus students that are kind of designed with a MOOC-like large-scale approach for kind of all the undergraduates. And in fact, because some of them are delivered via the VLE as well as different MOOC platforms, there's a kind of argument here that VLE might be being used now in a different way. And in fact, just to pick up one of the presentations from yesterday, I think it was, somebody was saying, how does MOOC impact on-campus student engagement? So this was a case study that they'd done at the University of Aberdeen, where they'd specifically created a MOOC for on-campus students, and they'd kind of evaluated how it affected their use. So I think this is kind of ultimate proof that there's been some sort of internalisation of MOOC activity for on-campus students. So overall, this then feeds into change, highlighting a need for change. So there was these questions tied into the previous two surveys about what levels of the institution do you think MOOCs have had an impact? And the kind of take-home message is that most people reported that whether you're talking about the overall institutional structure, or central services, or faculties, or schools, or the students, or looking at the staff, that the people were responding that there was some impact. Now, what specific impact individuals meant, the survey didn't go into, but it was enough for them to respond that they felt they could see some impact and change was occurring. But what are the real impacts? And this is kind of collated from the interview data as well, that for most institutions it's been a kind of discovery journey. So the actual production of MOOCs themselves has been a process of reorganising, finding out the best way to do it, perhaps doing things in a way that they hadn't done before. And that often there's a formation of central teams or use of existing central teams, as well as drawing upon existing staff. And that actually leads to more collaboration than ever before. And in fact, that previous presentation at the University of Aberdeen said that they just had massive collaboration across people and structures that had just never sat around the table before. So that's quite encouraging, I think. And again, the roles that were involved in the creation of the MOOCs, a large range of people, up from students, project managers, subject experts, quite a wide range. And then in terms of asking people again how they've been produced, a combination of the different techniques, so that could be a central team, a departmental team, or just individuals or at faculty level. The overriding kind of single way of producing stuff was, again, collaboration across institutions. So again, one of the quotes from the interview was that in terms of changing people's practice, it's kind of drawing importance to the need to be part of a team and not just kind of be the lone innovator, kind of plugging away or wanting to do something, that you really have to do it effectively with teams across the institution. But it also highlights the problems with doing that. So there's a rigidness with a lot of kind of, whether you want to call it quality assurance or just like administration processes that kind of, if you're trying to produce an online course or you're trying to produce a bit of flipped learning or blended learning and you want to kind of shoehorn it into the existing approval process, you're kind of limited by that. It's kind of forcing you to think in traditional ways. So there's an argument that in terms of change, some of it could be being stifled because unless you're kind of being infused or involved directly in some of these other ways, the actual process gets you to think in quite kind of a straitjacketed way. So does that mean that, there's a direction for change? And I think what it seems to be, it's kind of helped those discussions about those kind of roadmaps and in terms of, can we change our programme approval process? Can we kind of encourage people to think differently about how they teach, whether that's using the DVLE or bringing online MOOC content or online learning back into on-campus students. So I think, overall it's getting people kind of switched on to the idea of those. And again, people thought it was a separate issue as much as they thought it was partially a result of MOOCs, that, a lot of renewed strategies that have been coming out are partially connected to kind of MOOC activity. So that leaves a question about kind of future directions. Where are we now? So in the interviews as well, MOOCs have been referred to as catalysts of change, and I kind of agree with that. But it felt like in 2016 that there was still a lot of inertia. There was a lot of talking about doing, but the actual practicality of kind of new direction is kind of at the very start. And it's informing re-evaluation, but I'm not sure that the actual impact of doing has happened yet. It's kind of people about thinking about it rather than doing. So I'd kind of say in a summary that the production of MOOCs have kind of contributed to shifts that are already occurring. And they've definitely kind of maybe sped it up or produced more pressure. And it's also provided a great way to kind of highlight issues by having to produce things in a different ways, highlighted kind of blockages or things that were inefficient in the way of actually trying to produce this content and a different experience for students. But I kind of felt that there was also, so that you can imagine there's like ripples of change going on at different levels of the institution, but there's also different directions now happening. So one is kind of that you might be bringing ex-MOOC style blended activity. So ex-MOOC style, I guess, so originally you had constructivist MOOCs, which is more about the learner bringing the content together themselves through a structure, whereas ex-MOOCs is much more kind of the future learn other platform approaches where it's quite a linear learning journey, and really fitting that into on-campus activity kind of makes sense to do it in that way because a lot of on-campus activity is structured in modules and programs that go along. So is that kind of leading us off somewhere? But the other thing is that it's also raised online learning. Online learning's been, or distance learning, or whatever you want to call it, has been going on for such a long time and often been quite siloed. It's actually raised the profile. So I think there has been a positive impact on that. It's really kind of brought that into kind of the main university activity. So really, at this point, that's kind of where the research got to. Are there any kind of thoughts that people have about kind of MOOCs blended on-campus and distance learning and how that kind of picture is now fitting together? Or in fact, if you've got any general questions about what I've just been speaking about.
Well, good timing, first of all.
Thank you.
I have a question here, if I could go first. Considering how important technology is to MOOCs, you didn't mention technology as much in your research. Is that a purpose or mission, or you just didn't focus on technology at all?
So there's loads of questions that are kind of about the platform selected and had people found the platform inhibitive to what they wanted to achieve. So that kind of data's there. But in terms of kind of this, I did focus on the kind of the impact and the kind of the human side of it, as it were, just to kind of have some sort of focus down to analyse. But that kind of data is there to look at.
Just following up, I do think with that, but do you think there is any inhibit. So there is that kind of human element.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you've got to be realistic. I think things have been evolving, and to pick future learn as a case, it's evolved from nothing to where it is in a very short space of time. So, it's understandable that people producing things early on were quite frustrated because, quite rightly, you concentrate on making some features work, but you can't build everything at once. So, in terms of the human side, discussion, the next kind of thing that I think people are kind of unclear about how to crack is good ways of interacting, that you could have small groups or kind of personal interaction on a MOOC, because that really works in distance learning or online learning to kind of facilitate that community. But in MOOCs, it's still, because there's just so much, and there's not quite the tools yet to kind of grapple with that effectively. That's kind of a real issue, I think, whatever the platform is. If you pick it up on that, there's lots of data for kind of analysis. So there's lots of other questions that were asked in the survey, and the full survey results are available here. I can circulate these slides afterwards. There's raw data, and there's also that actually kind of summarises all of the other questions and kind of gives you the summary of them. But there's also kind of 2 potential collaborations in progress at the moment. So if you know that there's any particular questions or angles that you're interested in, it may well be that the data is there. So I'm more than happy to kind of share it with anybody or any colleagues that would be interested. Right. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.